Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar entitled Navigating the Global IVD Landscape. It's great to see so many of you on the webinar today. My name is Josh Dance. I'm SVP and Head of Production here at LSX Leaders based in London. Delighted to be hosting you today on this webinar, the next in our MedTech Innovation Series in partnership with MCRA. We have a number of our own community who are joining us today, but also a number of those who may be less familiar with LSX. So before we kick off, I wanted to briefly introduce LSX for those who don't know us. LSX stands for Life Science Executives, and we're a community and network of senior life science decision makers across biotech, medtech and health tech businesses, big medtech and big pharma businesses, the full range in the investor base in life sciences, as well as payers, providers, and other key stakeholders in the healthcare sector. As well as virtual and digital content like this, many people know us from our high-level, large-scale conferences, partnering events, and showcases that we run in Europe and the US, including our LSX World, USA, and Nordic Congresses, which connect our community through the year for education, partnering, and networking. We're delighted to be, again, working with MCRA for today's session, and indeed this webinar series. As a leading advisory firm and CRO for the medical devices sector with experience across regulatory, reimbursement, clinical research, healthcare compliance, and quality assurance, they're perfect partners for this series. And today you're going to be hearing from a number of MCRA's industry experts in the US, Europe, and Japan on key regulatory and clinical trends around the world in vitro diagnostics. I'd like to ensure we give a minute or two to allow any latecomers to join before I hand over to the MCRA team who'll be guiding us through today's session. So just a couple of quick points to mention before we kick off today. We will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation to put any questions you might have to the MCRA team. So I'd encourage you to all make use of this time and ask any questions or follow-ups from the presentation. To ask your question, you'll see alongside at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function and section where you can put in your questions, which we'll then get to at the end of the presentation. If you see a question that you want asked, you wanted asked as well in the Q&A section already, you can also upvote that question to show that you're also interested in that answer, and we'll look to address those questions that are upvoted first. If you do have any other questions or any help needed with the functionality within the webinar today, please do just send a message in the chat or to me privately. But that's it from me. And now delighted to hand you over to Alyssa at MCRA to kick us off. So Alyssa, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Josh. So before I introduce the presenters for today's webinar, I just wanted to give a quick overview of MCRA. MCRA is a leading clinical research organization and integrated advisory firm. We specialize in clinical study management, regulatory affairs, reimbursement, quality assurance, compliance, and cybersecurity support for the medical device industry. We were founded back in 2004, and we currently have over 150 employees across 3 countries, as Josh mentioned, the US, Europe, and Japan. Our IVD division is new and was formed just over a year ago. And to date, we've supported already over 75 IVD clients around the world in their efforts to bring innovative technologies to market. So today we will be hearing from IVD experts, Dr. James Mullally. Jim is our VP of IVD Regulatory Affairs here at MCRA. And prior to joining MCRA, Jim was the Assistant Director in the Chemistry and Toxicology Devices Division at FDI. Dr. Erica Conway, MCRA's Vice President of IVD Regulatory Affairs in Europe. Erica joined MCRA just last week from BSI, where she served as head of the notified body IVD. We have Sam Pollard. Sam Pollard is General Manager of Vorpal Technologies. Vorpal Technologies is in Tokyo, and MCRA acquired Vorpal Technologies earlier this year. Sam has been in Tokyo leading that effort on behalf of MCRA. Due to the time difference, we're not going to hear from Sam directly today, but we do have his session pre-recorded for you all to play during this webinar. And then last but not least is Dr. Julie Martel, MCRA's Vice President of IVD Clinical Affairs. Julie joined MCRA earlier this year and brings over 25 years of IVD clinical research experience with her, most recently as Global Head of Clinical Operations and Development for Essential Diabetes Care. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Mullally now to discuss today's IVD landscape in the US.
Thank you, Alyssa. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. After 9 years as an FDA regulator and having reviewed over 1,000 regulatory submissions, and now working with clients that have IVDs that span all of the review divisions at FDA, I've seen many of the challenges that manufacturers face when trying to get a novel device to the market. So today I'll be sharing some of my insights into these challenges, as well as strategies to address. So as many of you know, IVDs, in vitro diagnostics, can be loosely defined as tests that are performed on samples that are taken from the human body and that are intended to detect diseases or other conditions. These indicated conditions span virtually all of clinical practice. To name just a few examples, there are IVDs to detect cancer, diabetes, cardiac events, etc. And there are even IVDs that are intended to be used in conjunction with drug claims, such as therapeutic drug monitoring or monitoring for mutations that could indicate the patient is a good candidate for a drug, also known as companion diagnostics. Not only do IVDs vary greatly in these intended uses, but they also vary greatly in design. So they can be housed within large, complex clinical chemistry analyzers, as shown in the top panel. They can be smaller in form factor so that they can be used at the bedside and point of care, like the device in the bottom left panel. And they can even be designed so simply that they can be used by lay users at home, like the COVID test depicted in the bottom right panel. Next slide. Despite all of this variety, if you were to look under the hood and see what an IVD consists of, you'd see that all of these different devices share a number of common characteristics. So they all claim to work with a particular sample type. So that sample type could be urine, blood, etc. They detect specific analytes in that sample type. For example, a DNA mutation measured by next-generation sequencing. There is typically an algorithm that will convert that measurement into an output. So that output could be a concentration, a yes/no result, a genotype, etc. And finally, there's an intended use, which is communicated in the device labeling and which tells the user who the IVD is intended to be used for and what the results are to be used for clinically. So where is the IVD market trending? Well, innovation tends to follow challenges because challenges present opportunities for manufacturers to gain market share if those challenges can be solved. Next slide. So one challenge is that many disorders can't currently be diagnosed with a convenient sample type like blood or urine, and they instead require an invasive biopsy. For example, currently, to diagnose cirrhosis requires a liver biopsy. Not only can biopsy require the inconvenience and delay of a surgical procedure, which can delay patient care, but depending on the biopsy location, these procedures can also be quite risky to patients. The challenge of identifying less invasive sample types presents an opportunity for test developers. One example is the trend toward what are called liquid biopsies. And this is where a blood sample is evaluated in lieu of a tissue biopsy. These tests are often designed to detect proteins or fragments of DNA in blood that have been shed by a patient's tumor or other organ, depending on the disorder. Some of the challenges faced with this technology include sensitivity. So can the test detect an analyte at clinically significant levels? And specificity. Can the test discriminate between other disorders that may be affecting the same biological marker? So for a successful FDA submission, whatever the sample type, it's critical for IVD manufacturers to support through appropriately designed analytical and clinical studies that the IVD has acceptable performance for these parameters. There are also challenges identifying analytes that are clinically valid. While there are clinically valid analytes for many disorders, there are still many others which science has not yet identified an analyte that is clinically informative. Device manufacturers then, in this case, have the dual challenge of not only identifying these analytes through discovery, but subsequently by providing FDA with valid scientific evidence to support that these analytes can accurately identify the indicated clinical condition. Ideally, this evidence is collected prospectively in statistically powered clinical studies, but sometimes that approach is just not feasible. For example, there may be an issue with disease prevalence being too low, or simply that financial constraints make it challenging for the device manufacturer to conduct such a study. In these cases, which is quite common, where you want to rely on alternative approaches to support scientific validity, it's critical to be able to make nuanced, scientifically valid arguments to FDA to support that the use of the data is valid. Next is the challenge to develop more advanced algorithms. A single algorithm or a single analyte does not always provide the sensitivity or specificity needed to achieve acceptable clinical performance. However, identifying multiple analytes and determining how much to factor each into an algorithm can be exceedingly complex, especially when done manually. So to address this challenge, artificial intelligence or machine learning is increasingly being employed by developers to allow for the identification of analytes that, when factored together, can provide greater sensitivity and specificity performance. But for these applications, it's critical not only for the manufacturers to understand FDA thinking for how to properly train an AI ML algorithm so as not to introduce unacceptable bias, but it's also really important to understand what type of information and how to communicate that information to present to FDA so that their review can be efficient and avoid any authorization delays. Finally, I want to discuss the challenges of choosing an appropriate intended use. So given the number of disorders that do not currently have available diagnostic tests, the challenge remains for device manufacturers to design and validate IVDs that are going to meet these unmet public health needs. This is a multifaceted challenge, however, since test developers naturally want to market a device that's going to be used in as large of a population as possible. But they're faced with an environment where payers want evidence of clinical utility, and FDA wants evidence of clinical validity. Therefore, it's critical for manufacturers to consider the market, payers, and FDA, and how nuances in the intended use wording can potentially have significant impacts for either getting an IVD to market or the financial viability of the IVD once marketed. So I hope I was able to provide you with some thought-provoking examples of challenges and opportunities for innovation in the US IVD market. And I look forward to further discussion about how MCRA can help address these challenges. I now pass it off to Erica Conway, who will be discussing European regulation of IVDs.
Thanks very much, Jim. So it's really good to join you today. And so now we're moving over to Europe and looking at a different perspective from that provided by Jim in the US. So here we're moving to a very different legislative system. So Jim obviously has the in-depth perspective of FDA. And in Europe, as we know, the legislative process is laid down by the European Parliament, European Council and Commission, and that is then implemented and enforced by the competent authorities of the member states. And specifically for medical devices and IVDs, then, in order for those products to be placed on the market by a manufacturer, they have to declare conformity and sign a CE mark to those devices. Now, up until recently, a very small percentage of IVDs has required then designated notified bodies. These are designated by the competent authorities in the particular member state in which they reside. And so just thinking about this framework, we can see that there's actually a number of bodies involved in both the provision of the legislation, the implementation, and then the enforcement. And this in itself can provide particular challenges for manufacturers. So if we move to the next slide, we can then see that as of, you may be aware, as of in 2017, the publication of the IVDR actually then flipped that proportion of IVDs that would require a notified body, and now looking forwards, a significant proportion of IVDs will require a notified body for CE marking. The key thing to remember is that fundamentally the process of CE marking has not changed. However, the IVDR has implemented a number of requirements that have been rewritten, new requirements, and key things that manufacturers need to think about. One of the major changes has been the reclassification of IVDs according to risk, and the concept of clinical evidence and performance evaluation has been fundamentally changed from the directive. Now, we need to remember that as of the 26th of May 2022, the IVDR is fully in force. Now, the transition provisions, as you may be aware, have recently changed with the publication of a transition provision in January. This has revised the timelines. However, the key thing is to remember that for certain devices, though new to market devices and Class A devices, these will require full implementation of the IVDR. Next. Next slide. Thank you. And so the key thing that we, the key thing that we have to remember, just going back, with the IVDR is that there are many specific elements that manufacturers really have to plan and think about going forwards. I've mentioned the reclassification. However, there are significant changes to the requirements of technical documentation required, and as mentioned, that preparation in order that that documentation can be assessed and the QMS can be audited against requirements by notified bodies is now a real consideration for most IVDs going to market. In addition, a further challenge that we are facing in Europe is that fundamentally some of the infrastructure is still evolving. So for Class D devices, the highest risk devices, these are yet to have EU reference laboratories, for example, and the process of, for example, of consultation for companion diagnostics is still evolving. So there's a number of items here where we're still having to rapidly adapt, and this is where MECRA can support. Next slide. I just want to touch upon very briefly the situation in the UK. I mean, up until now, placing devices, IVDs, on the market in the UK has been helped by the transition provision of allowing the EU CE mark. Now, this acceptance of the CE mark will apply until the end of June 2023, so we have until the 1st of July 2023, where currently the legislation, that CE mark is being allowed. However, the legislation is under redrafting. Now, next. We are anticipating that following consultation of the draft legislation and consultation on the draft legislation, that feedback that has been now provided does give us an indication of the future direction of this legislation. We anticipate it will be largely like the IVD regulation. However, this is an opportunity for the MHRA and legislators to bring in new requirements or diverge in areas that they want to see to make the UK more favourable. So there may be, for example, some ability for the UK to recognise the certifications of other jurisdictions, for example, through domestic assurance. So the key thing will be going forwards this regulatory strategy and planning in order to not only meet the IVD regulation, but the changes that are coming under the UK legislation. Next slide. So in summary, from the European perspective, then the IVD regulation, it's in force now. It's been published for 5 years, and we're still in the process of transitioning. And that future UKCA legislation as well does mean that manufacturers need to approach new product development in a different way. moving from directive compliance to IVDR and UKCA does have a significant impact on resources. And although the transition timelines have changed for the IVD regulation, I think it's important to remember that for innovation, for new devices coming to the market, they do require IVD compliance now. And having just come from the notified body world, one key message is that manufacturers should not delay their transition and utilise the available notified body resources. So in summary then, key challenges, and this is where the team at MCRA are here to support our manufacturers. Forwards, next slide. The key challenges in regulatory strategy and planning, as you can see, a lot of change in Europe compared to the discussions that Jim is seeing over in the US. A lot of change requires regulatory strategy and planning. And as mentioned, that leap, the gap from directive to regulation is significant, and therefore remediation is an absolute must in terms of files and QMS processes, in particular, so that they can stand up to the scrutiny of notified bodies. I've mentioned probably the largest gap between directive and regulation is around clinical evidence and performance evaluation. And again, this is an area that really needs significant resource, planning and thought and action around. And as we move forward, the UKCA again will require further planning and actions in order to meet the compliance requirements going forwards of UKCA. So that was a very brief overview of the European view. And now I'd like to hand over to Sam, who's going to give us the view and perspective of Japan.
Thanks, Erica. So now I'm going to be giving an overview of some considerations when entering the Japanese market with IVD products. At a high level, IVD products are regulated very similar to medical devices in Japan, with a high degree of harmonization with FDA in the EU. So PMDA, which is going to be FDA's counterpart, essentially looks at these products at a risk-based classification system, just like FDA, where your class 1 products are going to have your lowest diagnostic risk and lowest impact of a misdiagnosis, and your class 3 products are going to have the highest diagnostic risk with kind of the biggest implications of a misdiagnosis. For class 1 products, you're typically going to be going through a self-certification under the Todokede process, which is similar to FDA's class 1 registration. There's no review of this product, and it's a very straightforward kind of not burdensome submission process. For class 2 products, you're typically going to be going through a third-party notified body review, similar to a 510K at FDA, where you're comparing to a predicate or comparing to a standard that PMDA has already developed for those types of products. Importantly, over-the-counter products are always going to be at least class 2. And if a product is a class 2 product, but it's a novel with no standard or no predicate, you're still going to be looking at a shonen submission, which is kind of the PMA equivalent at FDA. Class 3 products are ones with high diagnostic risk and a high impact of a mixed diagnosis. There's some examples here of products that have typically fallen into that class 3 category, and these products are typically going to require a shonen submission where you're going to need clinical data to establish the safety and effectiveness of that product, kind of irrespective of current products on the market. The review timelines vary depending on this tiered submission process, with the third-party review process going to be typically taking around 7 months for review, and that shonen submission going to be around 12 months, but it's dependent on the level of clinical data required, and that kind of determines how much time PMDA needs to review these submissions. Generally, overseas data is going to be sufficient to meet any kind of clinical data requirement in Japan. Most companies, when they are approaching the Japanese market, have already received FDA clearance or approval or CE marking. And so the first step that we're really going to do when we're looking at a product that's looking to enter the Japanese market is to look at that prior overseas regulatory submission, see what data were collected previously and how we can kind of leverage that data for a Japanese submission. And generally, overseas data is going to be sufficient to meet that clinical data requirement. The important aspect of this is that we really need to work to bridge that data with the Japanese population. So the first thing we need to look at is the impact of race and ethnicity. This is particularly important for drug products or gene-based products, but for other test methods, it may not be quite as an issue bridging that gap. However, the other area we need to look at is, how does that product fit in the continuum of care for patients in Japan versus the US? So if the standard treatment for these products varies significantly in Japan compared to where these prior approvals were achieved, we really need to look at the impact of that treatment and that continuum of care and how this product will fit into that. With that, it's really important to work with Japanese KOLs and medical societies of relevant medical societies to really speak to PMDA on your behalf and outline how this product would be used with the current products or current methods that they're using, to really explain the need for this product and advocate for a product like that, especially for novel products. The other area that we need to look at is the setting of care. So who's going to be conducting that test and where is that test going to be conducted? If that setting differs significantly in Japan as compared to where that clinical data was collected, we really need to look at the impact of that on evaluating the safety and effectiveness of the product. One important consideration here is that GCP is not typically required for IVD products. For medical devices in Japan, there's a fairly strict requirement that these products are done per JGCP, and there's going to be a pretty strict audit conducted by PMDA during this process to make sure that the data was collected per GCP. For IVD products, this is not required. When you're talking about sample size, the sample size is going to vary significantly depending on the purpose of that clinical data. And so if you're just looking to compare to a predicate product, typically a sample size of around 100 subjects is required. For a novel product where you're using the clinical data to leverage or to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of the product, kind of irrespective of predicates, it's going to be more of 200 to 500 subjects. And then for limited indications, like an orphan indication, the requirement for clinical data is going to be much lower. One other important key consideration with the Japanese market is that over-the-counter products are much less common in Japan than in Europe and the US. And so trying to achieve an over-the-counter indication is going to be challenging. PMDA only allows a certain select specimens outlined here for over-the-counter use and has specific exclusions for blood products and other sample collection methods. Right now, there are only 4 approved IVD product types, and they're all urine-based samples. So urine, glucose, and protein for diabetes monitoring, ovulation test kits, and pregnancy test kits. So at a high level, there's significantly fewer IVD reagents and test kits approved for over-the-counter in Japan as compared to the US, but the industry is working to try to promote a switch to more over-the-counter approvals. It's really important if you're trying to seek a new novel over-the-counter claim that you work with KOLs, establish that need for the product, and then really work with PMDA to outline what that what the regulations should be for that product and what the data requirements should be, and really having those KOLs and medical societies speak on your behalf for the need for that product. So at a high level, new over-the-counter claims are going to be challenging in Japan, and they're going to require a demonstration of clinical need, usability, and safety and effectiveness. When talking about reimbursement, it's important to understand that Japan has a national single-payer healthcare system, and in general, the reimbursement process is kind of an add-on at the end of the regulatory approval. It's not viewed so much as a separate application as it is in the US. So IVD products are generally categorized under the E category listing, with E1 being for existing products that you can adopt into, E2 being your product has some sort of new method or new test kit item that doesn't fall under E1, but it's not claiming some sort of clinical significance or improvement compared to E1. And then E3 is where it's a new premium reimbursement category listing where you're claiming improved clinical significance with your product. So for existing categories, the reimbursement is a flat price for each test category. So irrespective of effectiveness, you're going to get the same reimbursement pricing for your product. Importantly, this process is very straightforward and simple. Once you've achieved the regulatory approval, it's almost a near guarantee that you're going to be able to adopt into that existing category, and it's a very non-burdensome pathway. However, trying to achieve higher pricing is not going to be possible, even if your product is much more effective. So here's a quick example, of a COVID test kit outlining how that reimbursement pricing is going to work. And if you have another COVID antigen test kit, you're going to be adopted into this category. A key component to obtaining premium reimbursement here is to really have, work with KOLs, work with medical societies to get your product to be incorporated into appropriate use guidelines by those medical societies, and really have them advocate for the need of the product. Creating an E3 category is very challenging, and it requires that strong advocacy from Japanese KOLs and strong supportive clinical data. MHLW is looking at changing the pricing for existing categories to try to allow for premium pricing for improved effectiveness, but at this time, that's not in effect. So at a high level, adopting to an existing category is a very simple, straightforward process, but obtaining premium pricing for your product is going to require a comprehensive strategy working with Japanese KOLs. One unique consideration with Japan is the in-country domestic requirements. And so you need to have a domestic on-site organization to kind of be the responsible party in Japan for quality maintenance, inspection of product, and safety reporting. So to be able to hold your marketing authorization in Japan, you need to have 3 roles on staff in Japan, which is a quality manager, a safety manager, and a regulatory clinical manager. In addition, for IVD products, you need to have a pharmacist on site at your warehouse. There are generally 3 approaches to meeting this in-country requirement. One is to establish your own office, hire those required roles in Japan, and submit your regulatory marketing authorization on your behalf and own that marketing authorization. And then you have a lot of flexibility with working with different distributors. However, this requires a lot of initial investment. An alternative to that is to entrust an exclusive distributor where they submit the regulatory submission on your behalf, and it's a much lower investment cost initially, but the distributor is going to own your marketing authorization, and it's going to be very challenging to change distributors in the future. The third alternative is to work with a designated MAH like Vorpal and MCRA, where we can essentially submit the regulatory submission on your behalf. You would still hold the marketing authorization, and we would basically be able to leverage our on-site personnel to meet those personnel requirements in Japan, and to give you more flexibility with either eventually setting up your own office in Japan or switching distributors or working with multiple distributors. So those are just a quick overview of things to be considering when looking at the Japanese market. I'm going to turn it over to Julie to talk about clinical considerations with IVD products. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. As you heard from my colleagues, there are many regulatory requirements that a clinical study needs to consider to be successful. A clear regulatory path is key in translating these requirements into a clinical study, and these can be challenging. That is why a study needs to be designed very carefully. Here are only a few things that you need to take into consideration when you design your protocol. Which country-specific requirements do you need to follow? Obviously, it depends where you want to launch your product. Do you need to follow IVDR? Do you need to follow FDA? Do you need to follow both? Are there specific guidance documents that you need to oblige to in order to make your product acceptable? But also, how can you design your study to leverage some of the data in order to be able to launch in multiple countries? What population or intended use are you going for? Is it for screening, or is it for an aid in diagnosis and everything in between? Is the target population considered equivalent in all countries? As we've heard, there might be some gap that needs to be assessed for the US data to be accepted in Japan, for example. Is prevalence an issue? And who is your end user? Is your test to be used at home? Or is your test to be used in a clinical central lab in a hospital setting? And you can see just based on those requirements that your operators and your setup will be extremely different. Before starting your study, do you need to get specific agreement or approval beyond ethics committee? Eventually, you'll have to post on UTMed if you do studies in Europe. You need to post on clinicaltrial.gov. Are there any notified body that needs to be aware that you're coming with your study in their countries? As you can see, there's only a few items that you need to pay attention to build a very robust clinical design. Then comes the execution. You need to find qualified sites and principal investigators. And most importantly, in the right country that you want to execute your studies. But you need to make sure that your study is correctly supervised and often monitored to ensure quality data is being captured. And many of us have been challenged recently with the pandemic, where limitation to travel have been implemented. Some of your studies may have been completely halted. Some studies may have been continued, but you had to be extremely creative in the way to ensure the data collected was exactly what your study needed. Also, once you have your site identified, you may need to import the product to that country. If you don't have a PFF there, it might be very difficult to import the product. So you have to build this in your process and make sure that you give it ample time to happen. And finally, the outcome. Generating the right reports. You need quality data. You need the right statistical analysis to take place. Then you have to choose the format to present the data that meets the requirement of the country you plan on submitting. Is it a PER? Is it a clinical study report for the FDA? Is it both? Again, you have to pay attention to these requirements. And this needs to be made in a way that will ensure a successful regulatory submission. Next slide, please. So here, case studies, as I mentioned, comes with challenges, but here are some of the pain points that you may want to pay attention to. And Jim touched on those a little bit. First, the sample. I often say that IVD studies will only be as good as the samples that you collect. Is it the right collection? Is it the right matrix? What about stability? What about shipping and handling? These needs to be managed very carefully, and you need to act to correct any issues very timely in order not to eliminate some of the data that could have been used initially. If stability is an issue, you may have to change your site of collection versus your testing site, and that creates some challenges in some instances. Prevalence also may be an issue. Therefore, you always have to be extremely flexible in your approach to your design. You may want to build in a little bit more samples to be collected to make sure that if prevalence is an issue, you're not cut off too early, or make sure that you can enroll more sites if that becomes an issue to, again, expedite the enrollment. One other thing to take into consideration also is the evergreen regulatory environment. Anyone that is working with COVID will tell you how important it is to keep abreast of all the changes in the regulatory environment. And that's why it is extremely important to always work closely with your regulatory team and also to review your regulatory pathway as needed. Another issue also is limited clinical experience. At MCRA, we support people from around the world. But if you are a startup company that comes from a different country, you may have limited experience in conducted regulatory studies, and that's where we can help. It is extremely important in these instances that we develop a great relationship with the PIs and the regulatory, and to be able to help you navigate the regulatory field, because at the end of the day, executing a clinical study in a different country than your own creates its own challenges. Importing a product, if this is something that you've never done, is something that needs to be looked at very thoroughly in order to avoid major delays in starting your study. And as Sam mentioned, the good clinical practice ethics committee, sometimes that varies from country to country. So we have to keep that in mind. And therefore, partnering with the sites, the principal investigator, and the sponsors is very, very important. Last but not least, the cost. Clinical studies are expensive. This is not a secret. But most companies don't have the financial means to spend more than what they need to. And often will be asking us to leverage as much of the sample collection and data collection as we can to be able to submit the data to more than one country. So we are very conscientious about this. And again, we build this in the very robust clinical design, but we find ways to work efficiently by collaborating with our regulatory teams and the principal investigator and sponsors to make this less of a burden and successful study. So to conclude, understanding your regulatory strategy and importance of a well-designed clinical study to support the clinical utility and evidence are key to a successful market introduction. So I'll pass it on to Alyssa. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Julie, Erica, Jim, and Sam. So that concludes the presentation part of the webinar for today, but we do have time to open it up for some Q&A for the panelists. So I know that there is the Q&A box through the chat function, so feel free to put your questions in there, and it looks like we have a few coming through. So let's see. For Erica, there's a question, is US clinical data okay for CE marking?
Always $1 million question, that, isn't it? So I think the key thing under the IVD regulation is that under Annex 13, it does allow, it lays out actually very clearly expectations for clinical evidence. And in terms of clinical performance, it doesn't specifically say about where clinical data needs to be coming from. However, any manufacturer needs to put themselves in the shoes of their notified body reviewer. The notified body is there to ensure conformity for and safety for the EU population. So it's an absolutely natural question to ask, you know, how applicable is that and commutable is that data for the EU population? So really important to think about demographics, thinking about the analyte that you're measuring, you know, how equivalent is the particular infectious disease, for example, the prevalence between the different populations. These are the sorts of questions that the notified body reviewer will be thinking about. And so indeed, actually, US clinical data can be used for CE marking. However, have your justifications ready. Make sure that you are thinking about those types of questions about how relevant it is for the EU population. And so, yeah, they can be used, but, you know, with caution, think about it and think about your intended use, how the device is used in the EU.
Great, thank you. Let's see. For IVDR, can a US site be initiated and enrolled while a EU site goes through the review process, or do we have to wait? Maybe a question here for Julie.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm trying to read at the same time and I couldn't find it.
Sure. So from IVDR, can a US site be initiated and enrolled while an EU site goes through the review process, or do we have to wait?
That's a good question. I think you can do both at the same time, but I don't know, Erica, if you have further changes due to the IVDR, or is this something that we can do in parallel. As far as I know, this can happen at the same time.
Not specifically that I'm aware of, Julie. I think perhaps we can follow up with the person that answered the question and just confirm that, because obviously, like you say, the IVDR does bring in particular new requirements. And I think the question was actually for a companion diagnostic as well. So, you know, another element there about, and we know that there's a lot of challenges at the moment in Europe with approvals for companion diagnostic studies, because the centralized competent authority approval process is not up and running, and so multinational sites have to get approval from every competent authority for the member state where it is running. So it might actually be quite a complex question that the person's asking. So maybe we can get back to that person after the call, Julie.
Great, thank you. So let's see, there's a question for Jim. It might be a question for Julie though too. Can you give your top 3 tips or recommendations for clinical data for FDA?
Let's see. I'm not sure if I can give 3 off the top of my head, but I think one of the most often overlooked pieces of information that are critical to any clinical study design is the comparator. So on the US regulatory side, on for FDA, the comparator has to represent clinical truth. And so it depends on the device type, which is what makes this question pretty challenging. But if the device has a, if the analyte of interest has a gold standard, then that gold standard should be used. So for DNA-based tests, that's often Sanger sequencing, but not always. And for if it's a device that has a standard through mass spectrometry, it might be mass spectrometry. But for devices that aren't standardized, it's often clinical truth that's derived through adjudication through a clinical assessment. And in those cases, what FDA is interested in is what the clinical truth would be as communicated through authoritative clinical bodies that are representative of US clinical practice. So if I could just limit it to one, I would say that's the biggest challenge for clinical study data to be provided for review to FDA is choosing an appropriate comparator. And it's really critical to bring those kind of questions to FDA through the pre-submission process so that you can get buy-in, particularly if you're going to enter into a really long and complicated and expensive trial.
Great, thank you, Jim. So another IVDR related question for Erica. Do commercial labs offering LDTs and in-house tests for companion diagnostic studies, for example, for patient selection, qualify as a health institution?
That's a really interesting question, because there's a couple of elements to that as well. If I can just start under just commercial, I'm just going to pick up on the commercial labs offering LDTs in-house tests. Just start off with that part of the question. The definition of a health institution comes from Article 5 of the IVDR, and it's clear and under the definitions, and it's clear under that the intent of the IVDR, as we understand it, is that a commercial lab does not fall under a health institution. I'm also thinking about the fact that somebody's referring to LDTs, which is generally a US term. So if the lab is in the US, they definitely don't fall under an in-house exemption, because a health institution has to be in the EU. So in terms of commercial labs offering tests for studies, again, this comes back to that link to the companion diagnostic studies. And in terms of, again, it's quite complex under companion diagnostic terms, where a clinical trial assay moves into a companion diagnostic under development, and that might be partway through from feasibility phase 1 through to phase 2. At some point, a particular marker becomes a companion diagnostic in development, as opposed to any other clinical trial assay. So that's a bit of a complexity, but going back to the health institution question, I think it's safe to assume that they don't qualify under health exemptions, and so all parts of the IVDR apply. But if there is a specific question, I think it's worth hooking up with us after the call directly, just to confirm the situation, because that's quite a complex question, but a really interesting one that's currently under discussion as well within Europe.
Yes, and Erica makes a good point there. We will be sending out a copy of this recording and along with our contact information to everybody that participated today. So we are happy to discuss any, specific examples or situations further to give a little bit more clarity and detail than just trying to answer these more broadly. So I think we might have time for just a few more questions here. Maybe another one for Erica. What is the readiness of the EUC marking against the IVDR?
I think in terms of readiness of the market in general, I think it's really low at the moment. There is data out there to show the Commission and competent authorities are doing surveillance of how many certificates and devices are being certified. And MedTech Europe recently issued a very good survey around how many IVDs they think will require CE marking, which is approximately 24,000. And I think it's safe to say that the certificates issued so far under the regulation only barely touch that number of 24,000 that will need to be CE marked. So hence, please do action your activities towards the IVDR as soon as possible, because there's a lot of work for notified bodies to do between now and those transition deadlines.
Great, thank you. And it looks like the next one is also for Erica. A lot here in Europe. So when applying for clinical trials, the analytical report must be submitted. Does it need to be revised by the notified body beforehand? If not, what happens if the authorities accept the report, but the notified body asked about mandatory changes?
I think it's a very simple probably thing to comment on clinical studies, is that notified bodies are not involved in a device development until right at the end, until everything is done and you're ready for CE marking. So actually notified bodies are not involved in the development conduct of clinical trials themselves. So yeah, that's definitely a manufacturer and competent authority relationship, and notified bodies won't be involved at all at those earlier development stages.
Great, thank you. We did get a question offline here for Jim. What are the FDA review timelines looking like currently?
Thank you, Alyssa. Great question. There had been delay due to COVID workload, but now FDA is pretty much back on track. So for the 510K, those review timelines are back at a 90-day total review time clock for FDA. That's when that file would be in their hands, actually. That 90 days can be lengthened, of course, because if the file is put on hold, the device manufacturer has 180 days to respond to that kind of a hold letter. So you could add 6 months to that 90 days potentially. Likewise for a de novo, which has a total review time, FDA review time of 150 days, that clock could be extended by 6 months, depending on the length of time it takes to respond to FDA questions. And PMAs are 180 days and have a likewise hold time that can be added to the total review clock. That's why it's really critical to involve experts who can help you resolve questions in an AI letter. Not only can we help interpret what FDA is saying and what they're really getting to in a hold letter, but we can also craft language and help you bring together data that are going to be successful as a strategy for responding to those kinds of letters. And shortening that 6-month timeline from AI letter to response can really help you get to market faster.
Great, thank you, Jim. I think we have time probably for one more question here. So for Erica, is the UK looking like a favorable place to introduce new products?
I think it's a really good question, particularly as the new legislation is being drafted and we're getting a sense of what that's going to look like. And I think what is really positive about that future UK legislation is that, one, they're talking about medical innovation, a new medical innovation pathway. Apologies, I can't remember the exact words that they use in that consultation document, but also that ability that we think will be in place for approved bodies to be able to look at the domestic assurance, which means that, for example, the UK may start to recognise a PMA. So once you've gone through the process of, via Jim's experience of, the FDA approval process, it's looking like the UK, there may be that ability for domestic assurance to get it into the UK potentially quicker. So I think the benefit actually in the UK at the moment is not only are they looking to adapt the UK legislation to be somewhere that is good for new products and innovation, but they have the benefit of being one competent authority and one legislative body. And I think if you remember that diagram I had at the beginning, there's lots of players involved in the legislation of the EU framework, and I think that's a challenge, real challenge that's being faced at the moment. So hopefully things are looking bright for the UK in the future.
Great, thank you, Erica. So I know we're running up against time here, and I'm going to hand it back over to Josh just to wrap up with some other housekeeping items. So thank you, everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you to Erica, to Julie, to James for guiding us through today's webinar. Thank you all for joining today as well, and I hope you enjoyed and found all the content in this webinar very useful. As Alyssa mentioned, we will be sending out a recording of the session to everyone who was registered, so if you did miss it, or I see someone had attended a little later than planned, you will be able to view the whole session again. And also, as Alyssa mentioned, we'll be sending out with contact details for MCRA. So if any of these questions you would like to follow up with on some of the more detailed questions, very happy, MCRA very happy to do so. So thanks again for joining us today. There'll be more from MCRA coming in this webinar series over the coming weeks. So I hope to see you on those. And thanks all for joining again, and see you soon.